tonight for this panel presentation, looking at the next 4 years, what we might expect from a Biden administration. It's one of the great things about the College of Liberal Arts that we have a variety of experts and teachers on various subjects, and that's what we'll be presenting tonight, multiple perspectives on what to expect with the Biden administration. I'd also like to say that it's quite good that we're here together tonight in this format. As someone said on the panel earlier, if we had planned to do this on campus, the snow might have kept us all at home. So here we are, able hopefully to have some hot tea or maybe some chocolate chip cookies in the comfort of your own home as you learn a little bit about the next 4 years. Let me start by introducing the members of our panel. Our first professor is Karen Vasby Anderson. She is professor of communication studies, where she serves as director of graduate studies and teaches courses in rhetoric, political communication, and gender communication. She studies the culture of politics and the politics of culture, examining the ways in which political identity is rhetorically constructed and contested in popular media. Also joining us tonight is Tori Omega Arthur. She's an assistant professor in journalism and media communication. She has a professional background in television news, digital humanities, and strategic communication. And she teaches courses in media history, multiculturalism in media, and public communication technologies. Her research area specialization includes critical cultural theory and intersections of media, race, gender, sexuality, immigration, and cultural tourism, as well as social media-based televisuals. Also joining us tonight is Eric Fator. He is a scholar of international security, political theory, and the politics of global media. In short, strategy, struggle, and spectacle. He is an instructor of international politics, security, and political theory in the Department of Political Science. He teaches U.S. foreign policy, history of political thought, media and politics, and a handful of interdisciplinary courses that combine global politics, security studies, and media studies. Also joining us from the Department of Political Science is Matt Hitt. He is an associate professor and the undergraduate coordinator in that department. He studies judgment and decision-making in American politics, primarily in elite institutions. He is interested in how institutional and external factors influence the choices political actors make, especially at the collective level in Congress, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. Finally, we have joining us from the Department of Economics, Daniele Tavani. He is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in economics. His research focuses on economic growth, income and wealth inequality, and the interaction between labor market institutions, income distribution, and technological change. And finally, the role of the public sector in a long-run allocation and distribution policy. He also is interested in the role of social interactions and social multipliers in economic performance. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel. So our format tonight in terms of the panel is we have the question and answer function in Zoom available. So as we go through here, if you would like to ask some questions of our panelists, please put them in there. We've got our Director of Communications from the College of Liberal Arts, Beth Etter, who will help us look through those and thematize some of those questions. We also have several questions that have already been given to us before we start here. But I'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists, and we will go in alphabetical order here, to give us a short presentation, 3 to 5 minutes, about their view from their disciplinary or interdisciplinary perspective about the next 4 years. So Kari Anderson, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Dean Withers, and thanks to all of you who are sharing some of your evening with us to talk about politics. We know it's been an eventful and sometimes exhausting campaign season. So for folks who are still tuned in, it's a really important time in our political season. So it's great to have your interest and your participation tonight. So we were asked to speculate on what challenges lie ahead for the new administration in our areas of specialty. And so mine is gender and politics. And if I had to say what is the greatest challenge facing Biden related to women in politics and gender in politics, it would be a combination of high expectations on the left and potential backlash from the right. We just had, kind of an interesting presidential term where the president was sort of sexist and crude in kind of an anachronistic way, sort of out of time. We hadn't heard that sort of sexism for a while. But he also rolled back many protections and gains that had been made in the area of gender in politics, not only with respect to women in politics, but transgender issues as well, LGBTQ issues. And so there's a lot of pent up demand, I think, for people who felt like we made some gains, in the early 2000s, and then a lot of those got rolled back more recently. So people are ready for, on the left, are ready for some of what Donald Trump did to get, kind of overturned via executive order and other means. But combine that with this potential for backlash. Despite, now I will say, as somebody who studies gender and politics, myself and many of my colleagues were excited at the beginning of the Democratic primary because we seem to have more women and people of color who are highly qualified vying for the nomination. And I think a lot of people thought, well, maybe there will be a woman or a person of color at the top of the Democratic ticket. That didn't happen. Of course, Biden picked Kamala Harris as his vice president, which was exciting in that era. But what I think we maybe weren't expecting is, despite the fact that, Biden is an older cisgender white male, he's bringing a lot of change in terms of his administration when it comes to gender and politics. There's going to be a huge tonal shift in the White House. Some examples of this: in addition to naming Harris as his vice president, he's named 8 women of color and 12 women total to his cabinet so far. He's nominated the first openly trans woman as Assistant Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. His spouse, Dr. Jill Biden, will be the first presidential spouse to keep her day job. Vice President Harris's spouse stepped back from his career to support hers. And Biden himself performs masculinity in a very different way than did President Trump. And for example, Biden has called transgender rights the civil rights issue of our time. So all of these steps in a progressive direction, and we've already seen him play out some of these with his executive orders, things that he can exclusively control. And we've seen a lot of priorities of women and women of color in his big economic package that he's proposing and hoping to get through Congress. These progressive steps are going to be resisted by folks who find comfort in traditional gender roles. And while the insurrection at the Capitol of a few weeks ago, there were many complicating factors that brought that to the fore, but one of them certainly was a fear or a backlash against the perceived loss to white patriarchal power. And when I say patriarchal power, I think it's important for us to remember that it's not just white men who feel some anxiety, and it's certainly not all white men, but it's not just a certain subset of white men. Some women, white women in particular, feel comfortable in a patriarchal social structure, particularly one where they perceive themselves as having some privilege or advantage. And so I think the progressive steps that the Biden administration is eager to make, and that many of his supporters are eager for him to make, are going to be resisted in ways, that we've sort of seen examples of in other administrations, and we need to brace ourselves for again. I think certainly having a woman of color, a Black woman of South Asian descent as a vice president is going to be fantastic. And it's going to, I think, offer another mode where there might be some backlash to that. I think the last challenge that I wanted to bring up with respect to gender and politics is that we have to remember that women are a diverse and vocal constituency. I mean, we hear people talking about quote unquote women voters, but that's not a unified group at all. For one thing, political affiliation tends to influence people's political opinions more than gender. And so that's why you're going to see a lot of conservative and Republican women, not supporting a candidate who people, tend to think of as having a woman-friendly agenda. But not only that, a record-breaking number of women Republicans were elected to Congress this year. And many of them, including Colorado's own Lauren Boebert, have a very different agenda than Biden's agenda. So there's going to be, a lot of diversity, a lot of argument in terms of what are people looking for Biden to do to deliver on issues of gender, on issues of feminism, and on issues of intersectionality. So making sure that when you talk about women's needs, we don't sort of collapse everything into, one group, but we have to say, well, what are the needs and requirements of women of color, and consider all of those demographic considerations as well.
So thank you, Professor Anderson, for that. You've really packed a lot into a little bit of time there, and we've given us a lot to think about. Let's turn now to Professor Arthur. Can you share us your perspectives coming from your background in journalism?
Yes, thank you, Dean. As you know, and as the panelists know, and as folks around campus know, I am a former member of the White House Press Corps, and I covered the first George W. Bush administration. And so from that perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges facing the Biden-Harris administration will be how it crafts messages related to the racial equity initiatives that we've seen coming out of the White House over the last week. And over these last 6 days, Biden has signed several executive orders impacting marginalized communities, including ones related to the Keystone Pipeline, border wall, Muslim ban, federal government diversity and inclusion training, as well as COVID mandates, amongst others. And today's orders specifically address housing inequity, ending private prisons, Native American tribal sovereignty and consultation, and combating xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And in a speech before signing the orders this afternoon, the president said that he wants his administration to restore the soul of America. Because as he said, our soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism is allowed to exist. But I think the most poignant moment from today came in a White House press briefing with senior domestic policy advisor, Dr. Susan Rice, before President Biden's announcement, when a member of the press corps in their question to Dr. Rice noted that, well, Dr. Rice, executive orders aren't permanent policy, and that subsequent administrations could overturn the series of orders. And that journalist asked, well, how is the administration planning to codify these racial equity orders so that a future administration doesn't reverse them? Well, Dr. Rice, to her credit, she didn't have a solid answer there. And as a lot of journalists have noted over the last 6 days, details on how the administration plans to approach working with a narrow margin in Congress to pass what they're calling bold legislation that advances racial equity have been pretty light. And unfortunately, no heavier details came out of today's announcements or press briefings. And Dr. Rice stated that it's early in the administration and that she, along with colleagues from across government, would look closely to determine which of the actions could go further, could pass both houses of Congress and become codified. And that exchange was one of the, I think, first tests of how this administration will use the power of the podium, as well as the power of the press, to craft and distribute messages about how it will approach long-term measures to address long-term issues of inequity. And while Biden's address today and the series of executive actions today and over the last few days are very smart policy-related public relations moves, this White House press corps, along with an incredibly savvy American public, will continue to ask deeper how questions of this administration, especially as many organizers and activists have taken to social media over the last 6 days to say, well, we celebrate this historic administration. And as Professor Anderson just said, we have an incredibly diverse cabinet that's being finalized in this congressional hearings, but we will not hesitate to hold this administration accountable for its promises made to the American people. And just 2 hours ago, the Washington Post released a story that had the headline, Biden signs orders on racial equity, and civil rights groups press for more. And that raises a lot of questions. What will the next few months look like? Will we see photo ops with community leaders? Will we see press briefings from various government agencies like the Department of Justice or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, outlining their plans to address racial equity? And what members of Congress will be the faces of any legislation related to racial equity? Will we see an uptick in social media messaging coming out of the White House to reach larger swaths of the American public? And this is my favorite question: will we see an official White House TikTok account to reach younger Americans who are increasingly culturally and politically adept and will have an incredible amount of voting power in upcoming congressional and presidential elections? Well, I certainly would love to see a White House TikTok account. That would be quite delightful. And it would also be a big departure from the previous administration's views on TikTok. But overall, it will be interesting to see what messages will come out of the White House when it's no longer too early, perhaps 9 months to a year from now, to a year and a half from now. And many Americans want to see substantive legislation related to immigration, policing and police brutality, housing, economic disadvantages, wealth gap, and other issues that acutely affect historically marginalized communities.
Thank you, Professor Arthur. So, Professor Fatsworth, you've got a different perspective coming from an international approach to studies. We've heard some things here about domestic politics. Can you give us your perspective about the next 4 years?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Withers, and good evening, everyone. The foreign policy of the Biden administration is going to be focused on one broad theme, and this was made clear even before the election when Biden published an article in Foreign Affairs. This is back in March. And I believe the subtitle of the article was "Rescuing Foreign Policy from Donald Trump." And that's pretty much what the focus is going to be, at least for the first year to 18 months. Trying to go out to allies, going out to the world and saying everything that's happened the last 4 years, just forget about that. We're doing the things, we're going back to the way things used to be before Donald Trump entered the White House. And this is going to include a number of things that are going to be quite challenging. The first thing is to argue for the placement of the United States back at sort of the head of the table of the international liberal order, a position the United States has occupied since the end of World War II, a position that it has wanted to occupy and insisted upon since the end of World War II. Trump's foreign policy wasn't necessarily a 100% rejection of it, but it did call into question certain key elements of it. One, for example, was sort of questioning the utility of being part of the NATO alliance. Another was sort of encouraging the spread of democracy and free trade at every opportunity. Trump backed away from some of these key pillars of US foreign policy and the sort of consensus that exists in the international liberal order. Biden is going to sort of argue for, not sort of, he's going to argue for the United States to take the position that it once had. The key question here is, will the rest of the world accept that the United States is back at the head of the table? Do they want the United States now back at the head of the table? In the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs, former Ambassador Samantha Power wrote that the United States can't just declare itself back, it has to actually take some bold and tangible actions. And I think at the top of my head, she suggested leading a global COVID vaccination drive, stamping out corruption, and restoring or inviting more students in to go to school, go to college and university in the United States. I think on that first one, the problem is that the United States, because of how it's handled COVID, has no credibility to lead a global vaccination drive. And so the idea that the United States should or could insist on leading something like this as a way of declaring that it's back at the head of the table is going to be met with a great deal of skepticism and even scorn in many of the corners of the world. As far as the other two go, those are easier sort of to deal with. Stamping out corruption is something that's always been at the center of US foreign policy. And certainly inviting students to study in the United States is something that can be easily done now that Biden's issued some executive orders, reducing DACA restrictions and other things that Trump put into place. In the few moments I have left, just a quick rundown of a couple other key questions. On climate change, we know that Biden has re-entered the United States in the Paris Climate Accord. That was something very important that he needed to do, and he did that almost immediately, I think on the first day. He's going to have to figure out and state more clearly, because he hasn't yet, what the US approach, what the US strategy is going to be to China. Is there going to be a more confrontational strategy in the Asia Pacific region? Or are we going to recognize perhaps, and there's still debate about this, and there's no clear consensus in the foreign policy community, are we going to recognize perhaps that that's a sphere of influence for China and that the United States can't insist on being able to realize every one of its interests in that particular region? There's also questions with regard to the war on terror. And is this something that needs to continue, or is September 11th and the war and the events that began this century, are they far enough in the past? And is the threat of terrorism sufficiently diminished that we can sort of close the book on this war on terror? Notice that now that we've had another type of terror attack with the putsch on the Capitol, we're not really, the Patriot Act, which was initially designed to go after foreigners, is now being rethought and reimagined to now maybe go after domestic foes, either legitimately or illegitimately. And so this might be a good time to rethink the war on terror from top to bottom, because a lot of people, even if they obviously react with horror and shock at the attempted putsch, don't necessarily want to see the Patriot Act provisions extended and applied to potential US citizens. That's not close to covering everything that we need to cover with foreign policy, but my time is pretty much up, so I'll stop there and I can elaborate on other questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Fator. I'd like to take just a moment to remind folks we've got over 50 participants. If you are hearing some things here that you would like to follow up with questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll pull them together and ask our panelists as we go forward. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Professor Hitt. Matthew, you've got a lot of interest in American institutions and decision-making, and certainly there were challenges to American institutions over the last 4 years. What do you see in that regard moving forward in the next 4?
Right, well, that's a great question. Our institutions are certainly under stress. That has not really changed. And I want to pick up some of the threads that have been really nicely brought up by my colleagues here tonight. So there's been discussion from everyone so far about the president's use of the executive order, right? So President Biden has done a lot in just a few days by unilateral action, by issuing executive orders. But one thing that as a scholar of American political institutions, I want our audience to bear in mind, the executive order is mostly effective as a tool for a president to undo the things the previous president has done or not done. It's a really good negative tool in that sense, right? A lot of the significant executive orders we're hearing in the news about the Paris Climate Accord, about transgender folks serving in the military, about the Muslim ban, about the Keystone XL pipeline, about the Paris Climate Accord. These are reversing things from the previous administration. And as such, as Dr. Arthur nicely pointed out, there are some concerns about the durability of any orders that would come out for this administration into the future. And I want to give a little bit of slack to Dr. Rice, who was mentioned by Dr. Arthur for not having a good answer about how to make Biden's executive orders more durable. There is no good answer. She can't. They can't. The next president can issue another round of executive orders. And indeed, subsequent Republican and Democratic administrations of this country bat executive orders around like a football on certain issues. Just you'd sort of predictably, a Democratic administration will do this, the next Republican administration will reverse it. Durable policy change happens through Congress. So as a scholar of American politics, my eyes are keenly focused on the United States Congress right now. And what we have to bear in mind is that the Democratic Party has a very tight and narrow majority in Congress. They lost seats in the House of Representatives. They lost some Senate races where folks were projecting they were likely to win or be very competitive, and they weren't. A couple of really remarkable electoral upsets in Georgia gave the Senate back to the Democratic Party by the narrowest possible margin. So any major legislation is going to have to get the support of likely all 50 Democratic senators, plus the vice president's vote, of course. And what this means is that there are going to be certain senators, certainly our newly elected senators from Arizona, from Georgia, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, who are going to be facing a lot of very difficult votes in the next 2 years. What I've got my eyes on right now, the major piece of legislation is the potential COVID-19 Relief Act that has been proposed at $1.9 trillion. The question on everyone's mind is, to what extent is the Biden administration interested in doing the sort of longer, prolonged bipartisan negotiations that the Obama administration engaged in over the Affordable Care Act? Those negotiations went nowhere. The Republican caucus was unified in opposing the Affordable Care Act, a narrative that this was a partisan power grab, took over the 2010 midterms, and Democrats lost control of Congress that they did not get back until this election cycle. So folks are watching to see if the similar dynamic plays out here. Now, the crisis is different, right? The crisis of COVID is sudden, whereas the healthcare problems are more long-term and chronic. So there are some differences between the current political moment and the last time we had unified Democratic control in Washington. That said, I do think it's the most helpful analogy, and a lot of the key players, notably Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, are in place again for this round. And I think you do have to really watch carefully people like Raphael Warnock and Mark Kelly, who were recently elected to the Senate and are facing the voters in 2022 in some very moderate purple kinds of states. And the pressure from both the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and moderate voters, conservative voters, coming at crossways at some of these senators, I think is going to be quite intense. That said, the severity of the COVID crisis does lead me to believe that some legislation will probably be forthcoming. Whether it's bipartisan is anyone's guess, and I think it's unlikely given the constraints by folks like Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema. I don't think we'll see the $1.9 trillion number here.
Thank you, Professor Hitt. Professor Tavani, Matthew just mentioned the $1.9 trillion potential impact on the economy coming forward. What else are you seeing from your perspective in economics about the next 4 years?
Thank you, Dean Withers. Thank you for joining us, everyone. So since I'm a macroeconomist, I like to show some charts. So I've prepared, I pulled out some data from the Federal Reserve Economic Database to show you some of the challenges, and this is very broad stroke, top line numbers. And so I pulled out real GDP per person since 2005 to compare the COVID moment with the Great Recession. So you see that, between March and May 2020, real GDP per capita fell by about 10% only to partially recover. A similar trajectory for the what's called the prime age employment rate, which is the ratio of employed people between the age of 25 and 54 over the total labor force, and a similar trend for the labor force participation. My point here is that the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 is basically small potatoes compared to COVID-19. And so this I see as a prime challenge for the Biden administration. And these are just top line numbers. It's not to say that this is the only important things. There's many other things that will need to be addressed. But just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem. And so that's in the short run, I think short to medium run, key task for the Biden administration will have to be to get out of this and to get the virus under control, both for health reasons and also economic reasons. And so there's also some longer run issues that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. Before the COVID crisis, the United States has been in this trajectory of so-called secular stagnation. With falling labor productivity growth. Labor productivity growth is the way that economists measure the long-run growth rate of an economy. Clearly on a downward trend. There has been, I don't have the chart here, just not to weigh down too much. There has been some a worrying trend in the share of wages in national income since the 1980s, which has fell about 6 percentage points over the period. But also, and this is something that most people are familiar with, since the 1980s, there has been an increase in wealth inequality. Okay, so you have this series of worrying trends that predate the COVID crisis and the Great Recession that pose sort of longer term challenges to the Biden administration. Okay, we also had I would say that there's also, given the importance of the scale of the issues facing the Biden administration, like what results can people realistically expect? Well, just to sort of piggyback on Matt's point on the relief package, I see that I am confident that some measure, in some way, shape, or form, there will be some relief bill. And the way I see it is, this is going to be packing legislation that both addresses the short-term problem, which is the COVID problem, and the longer-run issues. For instance, individual transfers, meaning checks that many people got before in April, and at the end of the year, there's going to be some additional checks that will come to households. There's going to be a temporary expansion of unemployment insurance, which has been a very effective tool in combating the negative effects of job loss, especially that especially occurred in the service sector and for lower wage workers. One thing that I think it's going to be important to look for is direct federal relief to state budgets, because I foresee, absent something like that, I foresee a fiscal crisis pretty much in all 50 states, including Colorado. And finally, one example of a measure that might enter the relief bill, but it's actually going to be geared toward the long run, is going to be a gradual phase up of the minimum wage up to $15 an hour to 2025. So this is going to be a longer term measure that is going to be packed into the relief bill. This will have some effect on the inequality piece. And then, maybe this is just a little bit of wishful thinking, but we've been watching, I think all of us have been watching the news for the last 4 years, and I cannot remember how many infrastructure weeks we were sold. I think this is prime time for infrastructure investment, not just roads, bridges, and stuff like that, but also broadband, more modern infrastructure, and probably also even some retrofitting of the U.S. economy towards renewables. So I would say that this is it for me. So I think I'm eager to hear from the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tavani. I know that there's already been a little bit of back and forth. Professor Arthur, Professor Hitt, and Professor Anderson talking a little bit about executive orders, particularly the rapidly moving situation in Washington, revolving around some of the statements coming out, particularly Susan Rice's today. Professor Arthur, is there anything else about that statement that you heard from Susan Rice that you would like to address to one of our panelists?
Yes, I think Dr. Rice did a really good job of outlining what the Biden administration's policy is as of now. And in her statements and in her Q&A today, she quoted some really stark statistics related to the racial wealth gap and income disparity. And so my question would be for Dr. Tavani about, what economic policies would be necessary in thinking about this advancing racial equity movement and push? What economic policies would be necessary to make what both President Biden and Dr. Rice said, an economically equitable America for marginalized communities?
Should I answer? Oh, okay. Oh, thank you so much, Tori. So I'm just going to focus on two issues here. Okay. Number one, I think one of the aspects of wealth inequality that I briefly mentioned is also has to do with racial wealth inequality. Okay. So I've actually done some work with a former student of mine on this, Luke Pitak, now at Belmont University. The racial wealth gap at retirement, on average, in the United States, between a Black household at 65 and a Black person and a white person at 65 is about $300,000. Okay, so this is a big number, and so this is partially due to many things. There's an issue with bequests from parents to children. There's an issue with home ownership. This has very, very big ramifications. And there's also what we found in our own research is that there's a differential in rates of return across race in the order of about 4%. If for people familiar with compounding, like 4% differential in rate of return like compounds to a very, very large number, within 20 to 30 years, which is the horizon that we're looking at. And so to address this, I think one thing that we should be watching for is whether or not there's any appetite from Congress to pass some form of baby bonds, which is something that has been proposed by Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, these are two economists, but has been picked up by Cory Booker recently. And the idea is, to give everybody $1,000 a birth, and then $1,000 per year up till the age 18. This is gonna have some. It's going to cost some money. The figure is $60 billion per year, and so I don't know whether or not there's going to be something like this. But I think that in order to address the wealth gap, this would be something that is. I see this as a welcome proposal. And the other thing that I was thinking about is the problem with some basic public goods like education. I think the experience from the early 2000s with No Child Left Behind and policies is that it seems to pretty strongly penalizing communities of color. And so there needs, and this, education has to do with, wage differentials and so on and so forth. And so we need to see whether or not there's something planned in terms of systemically reducing access to basic public goods such as education in order to address the income inequality that follows from that.
Thank you, Professor Tavani.
All right, now to continue the conversation, there's something that Professor Anderson brought up that I really want to pick up the thread with and get some of her expertise on, if I may. So you mentioned that the Biden administration views trans rights as the civil rights issue of our time, and President Biden just issued an executive order reversing the Trump administration to allow transgender people to serve openly in the military again. Now, the question I have for you as a political scientist is, to what extent are you concerned about this becoming a new front on the culture war politics that were something we dealt with in the United States for many, many decades? We know that some of the Democratic victories in elections in 2018 and 2020 was fueled by a suburban exodus from the Republican Party. Presumably, some of these voters who either sat out the election or voted for Democrats for the first time in a while were your traditionally Republican voting, mostly white, mostly suburban, mostly middle class to upper middle class cisgendered women. Do you see this movement in a progressive direction on trans rights as something that will be politically beneficial to the Biden administration, or are we opening up an area of political conflict, potentially with.
Thank you, Professor Hitt. Yeah, that is, there's a lot in that question, and it's, there are a lot of important issues in that question. One is sort of what is the status of the culture war when it comes to LGBTQ broadly, but trans rights specifically? You know, we had a pretty fast movement on gay marriage in this country. You know, even President Obama at the beginning of his term, I think his first term wasn't able to be, you know, 100% enthusiastic about gay marriage. And by the time his term ended, you know, a lot of people had changed their mind. In 2016 and 2017, I think President Trump perceived that trans rights, he thought he could reignite this culture war. You know, we sort of had some victories with respect to gay marriage, but he saw trans rights, and specifically trans people in the military and so-called bathroom bills, as ways to maybe get some of that ground back. The good news is, I don't think that it worked particularly well. So if you polled Americans in 2017, some Pew polls that were done then, trans rights were, you know, kind of 50-50. A lot of people weren't enthusiastically in favor of them, but just 3 years later, in the summer of 2020, the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 9 out of 10 adults agreed with the more recent Supreme Court ruling, making it illegal for employers to discriminate against trans people. And in that same poll, 7 out of 10 Republicans reported that they think that discrimination against LGBTQ people should be illegal. And in fact, Republican strategists have said broadly that they think, you know, objecting to full trans rights is not an issue that's giving them a ton of traction. What I'm really encouraged by, however, and you know, whether or not this is an issue that will enable the Biden administration to capture, you know, more votes by so-called moderate women in the suburbs or whatever. I don't think that that's why he's a vocal proponent of trans rights. You know, and I don't, you probably don't think that either. I mean, what I see when I hear him talk about trans rights is a sheer political belief that grows out of his, you know, generally empathetic personality or attitude towards government. And I think that that's going to be more effective than any kind of, you know, move that might be motivated by political triangulation. So my hope is that the Biden administration is just a little bit ahead of where most Americans are on this issue. And then kind of a side note to that demographically, I'm hoping that the Democrats, when they're thinking about hanging on to a congressional majority, that, you know, the narrow congressional majority that they won back, won't only be thinking in terms of the sort of hypothetical suburban moderate woman. I mean, I think the victories that we saw in Georgia and other places let us know that, you know, we have a groundswell of support and enthusiasm among people of color, among Black women who are leading us into strategies that maybe haven't been tried as much by the two major political parties. And so I think those two things are going to mean that, you know, hopefully this reinstatement of trans rights won't be overdone or overturned by the next president through executive order. But I think in Biden's case, it's a sincere personal belief.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. I've got a question for Professor Fator, and that is another area where we've seen some fundamental shifts in that have some implications on domestic policy, but particularly in the world, and that's in the Middle East. Can you give us your perspective on where you see the United States foreign relations moving in that particular region?
Sure. This is a very complicated area. It's also a very big area. So it's not one thing, it's many things. I think for the Biden administration, the biggest thing is, can we resurrect the nuclear deal with Iran? That was arguably one of the greatest foreign policy accomplishment of the Obama administration. And remember, Biden was part of that administration. He had an active part in negotiating and finalizing that deal. And then Trump basically came in and torpedoed it the moment he arrived. So Biden is very interested in restoring that legacy. is very interested in trying to get that nuclear deal, which, aside from the appearances and the optics of it, was a reasonably good way of trying to prevent Iran, at least in the short and medium term, from developing a nuclear weapon. And if it's possible to restore the basic tenets of that deal, that would be an important accomplishment. Again, as I said before, the question is, are the Iranians, given what has happened the last 4 years, in any mood to come back to the table? Have they sort of say, no, the well's been poisoned, and there's no way we're going to ever make a deal with you ever again, given what happened after we took a chance with you last time? I think my suspicion is, and again, there's no clear indication of where this is going to go. My suspicion is that they do want to actually try to hammer this out, that they do want to try to restore some parts of the nuclear deal that Obama agreed to, and that many of the other main actors in the world, China, Russia, the European Union, would like to see that nuclear deal restored. Second point with the Middle East is what to do about terrorism, and specifically terrorism in Syria. The Obama administration's policy was regime change in Syria. We wanted Bashar al-Assad to basically no longer be the chief executive of that state. But Assad and by extension, the Russians had a different idea. And so that regime change was never able to be fully implemented. The Russians still have an interest in protecting Assad. They sort of like the stalemate that is there right now. So long as the Americans are denied yet another foothold in the Middle East, that is a victory from their perspective. So the United States needs to figure out how to navigate Syria and the future of Syria. It's interesting to note that in the first 72 hours of the new administration, Biden authorized, I think, authorized a caravan of about a battalion-sized caravan of vehicles back into Syria to occupy a couple of key points in eastern Syria. So that suggests that the United States is going to re-engage with Syria and re-engage with the actors there to prevent the recurrence of ISIS and to put pressure on Assad in case he decides to consolidate his power in the country. And then, of course, there's a question of Israel, what the relationship of Israel is going to be with the United States. Trump was very pro-Israel. He had a very good relationship with Netanyahu. Biden is not anti-Israel, but will probably not be as fawning in his interaction with Netanyahu. So I would look for, still a fairly close relationship between the US and Israel, but I wouldn't look for any progress on the Palestinian question. That looks like something the United States doesn't have enough political capital to actually make any difference on. And lastly, there is the emerging alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And that's another thing Trump has sort of boasted about when he was still in office. And I expect that Biden won't do anything to undo that, that it's still in the interest of the United States, even from the Biden perspective, to keep good relationships with Saudi Arabia, despite all the baggage that comes with it, and to encourage, cooperation among the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and some of the other states that have enjoyed a pretty good relationship with each other in the region, especially when you look at trying to balance the power of Iran and the threat that even the Biden administration will see coming from Iran. So, again, there's a lot there, but those three things I think are the most important.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the panelists?
I wanted to follow up on Professor Ardo's point on inclusive communication, and I wanted to kind of ask you, like, besides the TikTok example, like, how do you see, or what would you like to see from the Biden administration, right, to address the challenges that you mentioned before, especially in light of the fact that Biden sort of had some unfortunate remarks that he made during the campaign. You know, when you know, and so maybe it's not the time to repeat it. But so just that's basically my question. How do you see, and what would you like to see in terms of inclusive communication from the Biden administration?
I think what a lot of people who are taking to social media, especially right now, one thing I'd like to say before I delve into this a little more, we can't make distinctions nowadays between traditional media and social media and mainstream media, because social media has become mainstream media. And more Americans are getting their news from social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram even, and TikTok. We see more and more people who are using these platforms to have very in-depth political conversations in the matter of a 1-minute video, and engaging with one another in comments and in likes and shares, etc. And I think the Biden administration especially will have to figure out ways in which to tap into that. I think the Obama administration, I would call the Obama administration the very first social media administration, because prior to Obama, in the George W. Bush administration, those 8 years, social media was still this new and burgeoning thing. However, the Obama administration was adept at using the internet and this burgeoning platform of Facebook and this burgeoning platform of Twitter to get messages to many more people in the public who might not have been watching CNN on a daily basis or reading the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I think now that we are in a post-Trump administration social media era, I think this Biden administration, we probably will not see anyone in that administration being banned from a social networking site. I think they will be incredibly strategic in creating messaging around various issues that will appeal to large constituent bases. And I think they will take a lot of hints from a lot of really popular politicians, like, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's essentially a social networking site superstar, as well as Ayanna Pressley and Cori Bush, who's become a rising social media star as a member of Congress as well. And if they look to the tactics that these politicians are taking to have, fireside chats on Instagram Live, or we are watching AOC making pasta in a sweatshirt and her hair back in a ponytail and glasses on, this humanizes her in such a way that she is able to feel more intimate to the larger public. And I think we'll need to see a lot of that with both Biden as well as Harris. Will we see them doing these sort of fireside chats on Instagram Live or on YouTube? The White House does have an official YouTube page, so it's a possibility. And I think being able to use these platforms to advance messages will be key in gaining support for its policies in the first 100 days especially, but especially in this first year of the administration.
If I can jump in, I had a question. As you talk about gaining support for the policies, we've heard a lot about the Democrats winning back Congress. But I had a question for our institution, Professor Hitt, our institution specialist. I've also heard a lot about the filibuster. And I think it might be helpful for us to talk a little bit about the filibuster for our listeners, and particularly, why do we care about it? And is it something that the Democrats are going to try to hang on to or toss out with their thin congressional majority?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's top of mind for all the folks who are watching Congress intently right now. So the filibuster is not mentioned in the Constitution. In fact, it was basically not something that was a part of regular legislative practice in this country until the 20th century. The Senate has a tradition of unlimited debate, and in theory operates on unanimous consent. Its rules are not as strict or as strong as the House of Representatives. What that has evolved into over time is a de facto requirement that you need 60 votes out of 100 instead of 51 to pass a piece of legislation out of the Senate. Because if a senator filibusters, and all they have to do is say, hey, y'all, I'm filibustering, and that's it. There's no, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, stand at the front of the Senate and passionately yammer on for hours. They don't have to do that anymore. They just say, I'm filibustering, bill doesn't go forward unless you can break my filibuster with 60 votes. Now, that rule is just an ordinary rule of the Senate. So if 51 votes in the Senate existed to change the rules and say that that's not a thing anymore, folks, then that's that. Now, obviously, this is a very controversial thing because that filibuster is viewed as the one place in Congress and the one place in national policymaking where the minority party has some voice or some say in the process. So in an ideal world, that 60 vote threshold means, well, you've got to get some buy-in from that minority party to pass a major piece of legislation. So we don't make big policy changes on a unilateral basis. What that has allowed the minority party to do, however, is to stop almost anything, right? Any legislation. The number of filibusters that have been raised against ordinary legislation in the past decade or so is way higher, orders of magnitude higher than we've seen historically. This is not normal congressional practice to hold every big piece of legislation up to the filibuster test. So now the question is, are there 51 votes to get rid of the filibuster? Right now, the answer is no. Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have been pretty categorical. They're not voting to get rid of the filibuster. So presumably all Republicans would say absolutely not. So that's that. That said, the Senate has to pass a resolution just to do business and install the new senators and install the new committee chairs and just do business. And Minority Leader McConnell effectively filibustered that thing by saying, we won't support the organizing resolution until you promise us to protect the legislative filibuster. So there's already major jockeying happening about this. I think at the moment, the filibuster, as frustrating as it is to the majority party, and it always is these days, even though it is frustrating, I don't see it changing unless you see such a pattern of obstruction that senators like Senator Sinema, Senator Manchin, and others feel compelled to make the change. And indeed, the last time there was major filibuster reform done by the Democratic Party in 2013 about judicial nominations, the pattern was in August, they said, no way, we're not doing it. The filibuster stays for judicial nominees. 4 months later, they said, we're sick of the obstruction, bye-bye filibuster. So I hasten to make predictions in such a public forum, but certainly it's an open question to what extent the filibuster survives the next 2 years.
So Professor Hitt, that's really a good segue to a couple of questions that we have in the Q&A and over in the chat. There's one in the Q&A from Professor Greg Dickinson, and he mentions that Professor Anderson talked about the backlash that will occur because of progressive efforts around the current administration. Thinking about that in the insecurity of executive orders, should progressives pull back on policy change to reduce backlash? The question goes on, but I want to turn it to you, Eric, first, Professor Fator first, and then we'll see who else wants to address this issue of backlash on the left.
My view is that the progressives still don't really have sufficient amount of power to extract any concessions from the Biden administration on this. That they managed to sort of consolidate or create a powerful faction in the primaries behind Bernie Sanders, and when the Democrats started taking Sanders seriously, they swatted him aside pretty easily when push came to shove. And so I don't really see the progressives being able to have a huge impact. I know that's probably not what they want to hear, but there's still a relative, I mean, it might be progressive and left. I mean, genuinely left here, not merely a Democrat. Because I think when we talk about Democrats, we're talking about, what in the rest of the world would be essentially a centrist party, a party that, rules via expertise and technocratic knowledge and that sort of thing. And with progressive movement, there may be components of that, but it's also more about investing sort of in the working class, investing in groups that have been marginalized by the dominant classes of the past. And in the United States, the left just isn't powerful enough to muster what I think would be policy concessions that would make them happy. Universal health care, Medicare for all, abolition or sufficient or substantial reform of police and the criminal justice system, reparations on slavery, any of these things that really sort of give the progressives a lot of tingles is just not something that you're going to see Democrats, say nothing of Republicans, make any concessions on, because they just aren't a powerful enough bloc. And if all the progressives don't go out and vote, Democrats don't see that as something that necessarily prevents them from winning elections.
Thank you. Any other panelists like to address this issue of backlash? Giving you plenty of time to think about that.
One thing that I'll say, just from a kind of messaging perspective, is this is probably the first time in quite a long time that I've seen the Democrats be fairly united in their messaging across their progressive and more centrist constituencies. We're in sort of an unusual moment right now in that the Republican Party is struggling mightily with an internal factional struggle. And I think the Democrats were able to unite behind Biden enough to convince people that their party is sort of the adults in the room and ready to tackle challenges like COVID, where there is a fair amount of bipartisan agreement, in addition to agreement amongst their own numbers. So I'll be interested to see if the prospect of antagonism within the Republican Party motivates the progressives in the Democratic Party to lie low for just a little bit as a way to consolidate power on that side of the aisle, in much the same way that Republicans did, for the first 2 decades of the 2000s, even though they had pretty big ideological disagreements between the populists in their party and, what we would think of as the kind of economic conservatives. That rupture has pulled apart now in the Republican Party. And so it'll be interesting to see if the Democrats use that to their strategic advantage with respect to backlash issues in their own party.
Thank you for that. That's a great gesture toward the question that Sarah Haneke had asked in the chat about the aspects of the Republican Party and the change in domestic faith in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Professor Hitt, Professor Arthur, Professor Tavani, would you like to address this on the other side, the backlash side, or the aspect of how the Republican Party pulls together or doesn't?
Sure, I'm happy to weigh in a little bit on that. The Republican Party is in the midst of a really substantial identity crisis as a political organization. I think it's fair to say. I think you are going to be seeing right now some really interesting, battles, debates, whatever you want to call it, within state level Republican parties about which direction they want to go, if they want to forge a new path, or if they want to stick with the messaging and the kind of candidates that they've been running largely for the last couple of cycles. I'm really watching intently some of the things that have been happening at the state level in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Oregon, Hawaii, where you see these different factions really coming to different conclusions about what kind of candidates to support, what kind of messages to support. The state of Arizona's Republican Party just voted to censure all 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach the president, for example. So they're taking attack in one direction. You might have seen that Sarah Huckabee Sanders has put her hat in the ring to run for governor of Arkansas. She's certainly closely tied to President Trump, so her success in the primaries there in a pretty reliably Republican conservative state, I think will tell us a lot about what everyday voters in the party are thinking about folks with those deep ties to the Trump administration. Certainly, I think it's way too early to tell. Every time a major political party loses a presidential election, there's always a little bit of soul searching about, well, why didn't we get it right? And where are the voters? And where are we? And who are we? And the typical dynamic of these kind of debates, which you've seen, the particulars change, but the basic contours are, there are some folks who say we didn't commit to our true ideology hard enough and clearly enough, and that's why we lost, because voters wanted a true conservative or a true progressive, and by Godfrey, we just didn't do it. Or others will say, no, we need to tack to the center, we need to change our message, we need to change our platform, because clearly we're not reaching the voters. It's easier to lean into, we were right all along, we just didn't have quite the right candidate or quite the right message, and maybe we weren't quite right all along and we need to change. That part's harder, so that side often loses these debates, but it remains to be seen what will happen this time around.
Professor Arthur, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. There tends to be a lot of, especially media pontificating after a candidate loses. And we saw that in, 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency, and a lot of journalists and media outlets were filling newspapers and filling our television screens with conversations about how did Hillary Rodham Clinton lose this election. And I think that we're going to see that over the next few months. And today in the New York Times, we saw a story about Trump seeking to remain a political force right now, attempting to organize his team. And they're working out of Mar-a-Lago, I believe, and they're trying to figure out how to get him potentially back on a social media platform, though they feel that he doesn't necessarily need to be on a platform in order to raise money. And so it'll be really interesting to see how the media will continue to cover Trump, especially as we are approaching impeachment trials in the next couple of weeks, and how Trump will utilize the power of the office of the president as a former president to advance any sort of political agenda that he might have in these coming months.
Thank you for that. Professor Tavani, I think there was a question that intrigued you that you wanted to address. And I'll say before we're moving toward the end of our presentation here, so we'll have time for just a few more, but I want to turn it to you, make sure you can address that question.
Yeah, so there's a question by Jessa, and I'm just going to read it. Economists are split on the relief package, on if the relief package is truly the right way to fix the economy. Some say the stimulus package is a major need, but others say that people will only just save it or pay off debt. How do you feel about it? And I think you would be me. So I have a couple of points to make here. Number one, one thing is what is needed, like, given the fact that people are suffering big time. There's, still about 10 million folks that are unemployed in the U.S. economy right now. So there's an urgency to act in some way, shape, or form. And so but the other piece is like, what is politically needed for a stimulus or a relief package to pass? And so I think the negotiation will be there, like whether or not there needs to be buy-in for people like that didn't lose their jobs, right? But they're going to get a transfer nevertheless, or not. And I think there's going to be some interesting discussions and debate to watch in this regard. For instance, Senator Manchin has already said that he's not very keen on giving blanket transfers like to everybody making $75,000 or less per year. So we'll see how that conversation goes. But on the sort of the Keynesian stimulus part of your question, which is, what the problem is, with the transfers is that if people save them or they use them to pay off debt, this money doesn't go back into the economy in the form of spending, and therefore it doesn't stimulate. Yes, true. But on the one hand, both these pieces, both increasing savings and debt payoff, create the conditions for future demand. Okay, and so this is also something that economists have been emphasizing quite a bit. The fact that there has been an increasing saving, for instance, following the CARES Act transfers, But these savings are there to be spent for when the pandemic is over and people are going to resume their normal spending habit. And they're similar thing like with debt payoff, like a person that is not strangled by that anymore, or less strangled than before, can go out and spend like some money in the future. So I wouldn't worry too much about the issue with the money not being spent, or not all the money that people are gonna get being spent.
Thank you, Professor Tavani. Professor Hitt, we've got a question about the stability of Congress in the next 4 years. Would you like to address that?
Yeah, I really liked this question from Bronson that came through the Q&A. So the question is, will we ever see a stable Congress again that's not dysfunctional and destabilized and chaotic and careening about? And I like this question because I think political scientists and other social scientists have certainly been thinking about this for a while, that Congress is institutionally growing weaker and weaker. And this isn't just over the last few years. This is for most of the 20th and 21st centuries. And I would say the culprits are primarily two things. So one, American politics is increasingly nationalized. So folks vote based on how they perceive the national political parties, especially the president and candidates for president, really prominent politicians in the opposition. That's combined with, sort of paradoxically, the fact that our elections for Congress are competitive enough that any majority in Congress is unstable. It is relatively easy within a few cycles for one party to take a chamber or both chambers back from the other party right now. And that means if you're the party in the minority, your goal is not to make policy and try and win re-election at the local level, it's take the chamber back. And that's a very different political strategy, right? Winning your district or your state implies getting things done for your constituents. Winning the chamber implies making the majority party look bad and turning the national mood against the folks in power. And so will we ever see a stable Congress again? Never say never, right? But certainly this trend of unstable majorities and nationalized politics does not lend itself to the sort of, I'm not sure they ever really existed, but this notion of the good old days of bipartisan policymaking in Washington. And to be fair, those good old days of the 1950s to 80s, the bipartisanship was racially conservative to racist Southern Democrats allying with conservatives in the other party to have bipartisanship in ways that were actually not great, were actively bad, right? So again, how much we want to wax rhapsodic about the good old days, I think remains to be seen. But that kind of stability, bipartisanship, is going to require some coalitions that just don't exist right now.
Well, thank you for addressing that. So let me, at this point, remind folks that there will be a recording of this event that will be found on Source. We'll do an article about that. So if you'd like to go back and check those things, please do so. I'd also like to take a moment for thanking all of you for being here. We've had a consistent audience of 50 people all the way through. And I think that's a reflection not only of your interest in this topic, but the incredible knowledge and expertise that we had on this panel. And I want to thank each and every one of them for taking this hour and a half, and even longer, because we had meetings to prepare for this, to come in and to share their wisdom with you. What I'd like for them to do, if they're willing, is to leave you with a little snippet of their wisdom looking forward. So I'm going to ask each of them, we'll go through in alphabetical order again, either to give us a prediction or a short comment about the next 4 years, things that we should look out for. So Professor Anderson, we'll start with you.
Thanks. I won't make a prediction because I'm a terrible prognosticator, but what I will say, I liked where Professor Hitt ended and pointed out that a lot of the bipartisanship of previous eras was based on alliances between racist or elite or majoritarian positions that were not representative of many people in this country. And something that I'm looking forward to in the next 4 years is a critical mass of women and people of color in important decision-making positions, everything from the Vice President of the United States to the Treasury Secretary and other positions. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that changes our policy proposals and governance overall.
Thank you. Professor Arthur.
Along those lines, I think we are going to see more women as well as people of color in leadership positions who will be spokespeople for this administration and who will lead efforts to create the sort of coalitions that would make it necessary in order to pass legislation on pretty much all of the issues that we've been discussing tonight. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what sort of unified public relations bloc or media bloc that we see over the next 4 years coming from this administration as well as from the Democratic Party.
So thank you. Professor Fatwa.
I'll keep it short. US relations with Russia will remain cold, but we will get a new arms reduction treaty in the next 2 years.
Professor Hitt.
So I know I tend to come across as maybe a little, it's hard and it's cynical, but as I remind my students all the time, there's a wonderful old quote from Otto von Bismarck that if you like laws or sausages, you should never watch either being made, which is very unfair to folks who make sausage, by the way. The miracle of representative democracy, and it really is a miracle, is that this is a way human beings have devised to manage deep, meaningful, important conflicts without resorting to violence. And so if it feels messy, if it feels hard, if it feels really difficult, well, it is. But the alternative is so much worse. And this ability of ours to disagree with each other and to still govern ourselves and run a society according to these principles of representation is a really wonderful and encouraging thing. So as you see folks in Congress bickering, they're doing that for you, for us, so that we continue to have a society based on principles of representation. And I hope to see that very much continue long after I'm gone.
Thank you. The penultimate word, Professor Tavani.
All right, thank you. So I should also be not be making predictions because everybody knows that macroeconomists are horrible at making predictions. So the one thing that I can say is that it seems from the start that the Biden administration is gonna, and this is almost a prediction, they're gonna do whatever it takes to get COVID-19 under control. Okay, this is something that it seems pretty obvious from the way they're approaching their term in office. Now, whether or not this is going to be enough, it's anyone's guess, especially because this is a global pandemic, right? So there are repercussions about from economic activity and economic circumstances in other parts of the world into the United States and vice versa. So we need to see going forward. And then I'm gonna close with some personal wish. I wish that I hope that this administration is going to take some time addressing some systemic inequalities that have been characterizing the U.S. economy and society for too long. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, we're just a couple of minutes over. So hooray, we did a great job there. On the behalf of the College of Liberal Arts, the Departments of Communication Studies, Economics, Journalism and Media Communications, and Political Science, and also my cat, Bo, I thank you all for joining us here tonight, and we look forward to many more conversations like this. Have a wonderful night. Thank you all.